but really flourish. We know that a lot of money and time and energy is being invested into ecosystem restoration around the world, but many of these projects simply aren't taking. And we want to see what was the difference between those that worked and those that didn't work. And so we did this work to contribute to the UN Decade on Ecosystems Restoration, really trying to accelerate and grab and make all these things work. Because we know, especially in this time, in this place, we're seeing really the crisis in our biodiversity, the real need for an accelerated path on these issues, and they need to be contextual, they need to be localized. And so we worked and met with and spoke to these communities to see how it worked out. And so today's session is going to be a little bit of an exploration of that and into this restoration guide that we hope will help inspire these conversations at local communities around the world. Lauren will speak a little bit more about that, and see how we can work together, both within our faith traditions and outside faith traditions, and getting this work really institutionalized in a way. So delighted to introduce the panelists that we have. We have Lauren Van Ham. She is the Climate Action Coordinator at the United Religions Initiative. Corinna Gore is the founder and director of the Center for Earth Ethics, my wonderful boss. And then we have Diane Kalimi. She's the Program Management Officer at UNEP. And then in time, Oscar Soria, who's the campaign director at Avaz, will be joining to share some remarks. And so to open up the conversation, Lauren, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the guide, why it matters, and the cooperation circles to whom it is going to be first introduced to.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for joining us today. As the climate coordinator for the United Religions Initiative, I have the really good fortune of working with grassroots actors around the world. We call these groups cooperation circles, and to be in a cooperation circle, there are 3 or more faith traditions or indigenous expressions represented, and then that cooperation circle goes about doing something that is important where they live. It could be acts of peace building, it could be acts of ecosystem restoration, which is what we're talking about today, but other things too in an interfaith grassroots context. So when Gopal Patel and Andrew approached URI about these consultation circles and conversations that they were having, we initially thought, how can we make sure that the good things learned in these consultation groups will be replicated and will be shared in other ecosystems around the world. This guidebook, it's brand new, it's launching today. We have a QR code to share with you all. This guidebook will give you interesting case studies, just one-pagers about what happened in the consultation groups last year with a link. You can go and watch the recording of these consultations, but it also provides groups with a step-by-step guide so that they can create a relevant consultation for an ecosystem where they live. And that's the most important part. Not so that we look like the consultation that happened in Jordan or the consultation that happened in Louisiana. We want the consultation to look and fit right where you are for the ecosystem where you live.
That's absolutely right. And so we're really thrilled, and we hope that this resource does that. I think there's so many of us who see what's happening in the world and we don't know how to interact. We don't know how to begin these conversations. We don't know how to articulate. It's felt, especially in these last few years where so much has really changed. And the climate crisis is so profound for so many of us. And so we hope that this is a way to talk about these issues. And Corinna, I want to turn to you because there's so much happening on ecosystem restoration. So much can feel statistical, it can feel bureaucratic, and it can be a numbers game. How many trees planted, hectares restored? But what does that mean to the people who are living there? What's their relationship with the land? And how do we interact with it in a different way? What does this relationship look like? And so, Corinna, you had this quote that I love that I want to read. You said that ecosystem restoration is healing wounds we have inflicted to the earth, to each other, and to ourselves. and is also about forging another way of being together in the future. Why is ecosystem restoration as much a question about ethics as it is about the on-the-ground implementation?
Thank you so much. I just want to begin by congratulating and thanking Andrew and Lauren, who took the lead on this wonderful guidebook. We are really proud and honored to be a part of this work at Center for Earth Ethics, and it's a great occasion. So thank you. And I would say it is a matter of ethics because this is a matter of human behavior. And ethics is really about right and wrong and the implications for our behavior individually and collectively. And so although ethics undergirds our laws and social norms in any society, it is also most powerful at times when a deep sense of right and wrong, maybe a growing, deeply, widely shared sense of right and wrong, is out of step with both laws and social norms. So we can think that that was the case in the abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement in the United States, where I've come from. And today, it's that way today when it comes to climate, ecology, biodiversity loss. People have a deep and growing shared sense that something is very wrong. And yet our laws and social norms are on the other side. In fact, a lot of what's driving biodiversity loss is perfectly legal and socially encouraged. And so ethics is what we have to talk about, to think about how to change this. And I think that it's very important when we look at how to change human behavior to understand that we're living in a place and a time in human history in which there's also been a sort of imbalance. There's a kind of mechanistic worldview, more of a reductionist way of thinking. Scientific knowledge, technology, all of this has been really ascendant in how people measure things like success, worth, wealth. And yet we know that that is discordant with what really drives people and what's most deeply held in terms of what they value. And so when we look at changing this behavior, we can look at it from that point of view. And in closing, I just want to say that I think one of the wonderful things about this series of consultations is that it included St. James Parish in Louisiana, a case of environmental injustice and racism right in the United States. So we're talking about what's called the wealthiest nation on earth, what's called the most developed nation on earth, and yet we have people living with with very high cancer rates and asthma rates, with serious health problems, surrounded by petrochemical factories. And there's yet another petrochemical factory that's being proposed to go in where they live, and they're told, no, it's economic growth, it's jobs. This is part of the way that we measure things, this is a good thing. And on the other side, they're not only saying, no, what about human health? Because of course, their sense of ecosystem restoration and all of ours is that humans are part of ecosystems. So they're not only saying human health, but the voices from St. James Parish are also saying, we remember when there were birds here. We remember when we could gather food from the forest here, when we planted gardens. It's desolate now. And so this series of the consultations and the guidebook that results is not only looking at the things that we're used to hearing about statistics, about how development and nature can go hand in hand. It's looking deeply critical at the development paradigm, because that's what we need to do, not just look at developing countries through a lens of fixing, but look at the most developed countries and societies on earth and fix what's wrong there as well. So I appreciate the question. I'm so honored to be in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinna. Yeah, and I think that's one of the pieces that, and I'm glad you brought that example in, because what we've done to nature is so much of what we've done to each other. We can't take away the racism, the sexism, any of these pieces, the colonialism that have driven this attitude and this idea and this mentality towards not just the earth, but to one another. Wherever you find one of these ecosystems that has been degraded, you're going to find a community that has been devastated as well. And these are part and parcel. And so in order, and what we found in a lot of the consultations that we did there was a unique conversation about the ecosystem and how to repair that, but there was this broad universal conversation about the conditions that led to the degradation of that. And so much of the work of ecosystem restoration is also community and social restoration. What does it take? What conversations do we need to unpack? These histories that are uncomfortable, that are painful, that need to be approached, so that we can really get at these root causes. Our solutions have to meet the cause. And so I want to, Diane, bring it to you a little bit. You work with UNEP, you're doing, well, I'll let you share a bit more about your expertise because you've got it down. But I'm curious, when you look at the role of faith, the work that's happening there, and then more on this implementation side of looking at holistically what's going on with these different measurements and ecosystem projects, how this piece on values and culture can really help propel and inform what we're going to do next.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and I'm very pleased to be here today on behalf of the United Nations Environment Program. And I would like to congratulate you on launching this wonderful guidebook on spirituality and the intricate linkages with land and ecosystem restoration. I think it's really time that we do so. We link the two, and in this really wonderful platform, today is the launch of many events with the United Nations on the decade of ecosystem restoration. So it's good to see that this is happening here at this wonderful room, in this wonderful room. So I would like to also acknowledge and thank the work that has been done already with you, acknowledging the work with the Center for Ethics, my colleague Iyad, who worked with you. We at the United Nations Environment Program, who are based in Nairobi, Kenya, have a lot of work that we're doing, and really it's on environmental sustainability programs and creating digital spaces to monitor environmental actions, ecosystem restoration and management, ecosystem governance. So all of this needs to be linked to the work of stakeholders, and stakeholders include the women's group, the indigenous communities, and the faith-based organizations. So I'm really very happy to acknowledge that in the past 2 to 3 years, during the pandemic, UNEP has mobilized a lot of action and dialogue with faith-based organizations through the Faith for Earth initiative, and we're very pleased and honored that we have done so and done a lot of consultations that led to common statements, contributions by faith-based organizations to the CBD Secretariat in the form of inputs to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework while it was being developed, and now it's being negotiated with wonderful 22 targets. And in the negotiation rooms, we're trying to reflect all the stakeholder actions and the role of stakeholders in driving ecosystem restoration, ecosystem change, and sustainability, achieving living in harmony with nature. So this is really what we're all trying to do. But what is really very important as well is that we not only drive action, but monitor action. Monitor action meaning that in the next few years, up until 2030, we are putting these ambitious targets, but someone needs to monitor them. So UNEP has been creating digital spaces, working in our member states, 195 countries, tools that we are launching, such as my work is leading a group called, a team called the Data Reporting Tool, rolling a tool that is for multilateral environmental agreements. CBD is an MEA, and CMS, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the Plant Treaty Convention, these are mechanisms that drive law and policies and reporting. So reporting to these multilateral environmental agreements means that actions have to be monitored. and in one space, in a synergistic manner. So we've been working in Cameroon. My colleague Stanislaus is here today. And they've been integrating the work of indigenous and local communities. We have the gender plan of action, also with its targets going to be monitored in that space. And now that we are here also, we would like that also faith-based organizations in Cameroon be including their work, and that the work is monitored in the future, so that really action is really effective and achieving these ambitious goals and making sure that stakeholders are driving the action, those that are at the grassroots, as you said, those that are really in the communities, preserving, conserving, using, and these natural resources, so in a sustainable way. So that's from my side. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I do think there's these pieces on monitoring and storytelling and story sharing, because there's with the magnitude of work that needs to be done, I feel like so many of these stories need to be heard, they need to be amplified. People need to see that it's been done already, and that's one thing that we hope with this, and of course with the measurement that you're doing, to really show and share, this is possible, these are different ways that you can do it, these are different ways that can be constructed to help inspire some action. And so now I want to welcome Oscar Soria, who is amazing. And Oscar, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're a very busy man. But one piece I wanted to talk about when we think about ecosystem restoration, Corinna, you raised this up a little bit as well, is this human rights connection, and how we need to acknowledge, uplift, and secure and maintain. I know there's a lot of critique of the 30 by 30 plan from different indigenous groups and different local populations saying, we need to be careful about how we define, protect, and preserve these spaces so that there is human rights are preserved, because we know, as we were saying earlier, there's such a connection between ecosystem degradation and human rights. And so I was wondering if you could, from the work that you do at Avaz, kind of speak a little bit to that.
And I think, and so this, when we talk about reconciliation, we talk about all how in any restoration process we need just to also restore the harm. I mean, we need to restore relationships within the social fabric, but also how are we going just to bring that reconciliation from the perspective of recognition and restitution. So that's the three that I wanted just to also put in this dynamic: reconciliation, restitution, and recognition. So meaning the recognition that we need just to recognize different actors that hasn't been invisibilized. And for us, the main critique that we have for the 30 by 30 target is that we already achieved that. So across all the studies that are since 2020 onwards, if we keep visibilizing the role of indigenous peoples, the customary management of indigenous peoples in the lands, we are already on 34% of our lands covered by indigenous peoples and local communities now. We don't need to wait for 2030. This means that the target is kind of a nothing burger's target, because it's a target that has been already achieved despite the persecution of indigenous peoples, despite the violation of human rights, and so on. So what we basically were calling here is a higher target, because we do believe that there are other areas and there are other unrecognized communities, for instance the Uyghurs in China, and many others, that hasn't been systematically invisibilized by the UN system somehow, but also, and more importantly for many governments. We have just to put those peoples out, and that's basically go with the recognition. And then it comes to restitution. And so one of the things that in Navas we've been pushing, and unfortunately we haven't really had much traction here at the CBD, is a full recognition of indigenous people's lands by 2025. If this is possible, this is doable, it's financially possible to do so, because in fact, many governments could actually create what we put forward a proposal on debt swap for land tenure. So that's basically, you have very practical ways in which governments can in fact facilitate those land recognitions now. We don't need to wait until 2030, because I think there is the question of justice is the question that we have just to be clear here. So the biodiversity crisis is a justice crisis. It's a crisis that has to do with the concentration of lands and power and money, and we need just to really rebuild that. And that actually has this element of the other re in this case. So it is about how we reconnect our social fabric in a way that all of us can be part of this place without leaving anyone behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oscar. There's this question, and I think that's challenging, and I'm so glad you raised it up, of just, and Corinna, you did as well, this piece around economy, around capitalism, around extraction. And this piece, and Corinna, I kind of want to ask you, because the center in the past, we've done a lot of work on getting beyond GDP, on these larger economic systems. So how do you see this connection piece, right, of how we're, on the one hand, we need to reform our relationship with nature, but on the other hand, and this is a larger worldview sort of question, really interrogate the ways that we look at consumption, that we look at economy, and one another as pieces in this puzzle. So if you could share a bit on that.
Thank you so much. I was just thinking about that, the GDP piece. But let me first say that I appreciate all that you all have brought into this conversation, and just to note that we are on the Haudenosaunee lands, and they have been particularly vocal about, through the decades, about the problem with the development model that has been pushed on the rest of the world. And in a book that was eventually published by Akwesasne, I know it's Akwesasne not far from here, called A Basic Call to Consciousness, there was the Haudenosaunee message to the Western world, in which they said exactly that. They said, do not make the mistake of pushing the development model on the rest of the world that was imposed on us right here, and really right here where we are. And they said the rest of the world identifies with the ways of nature, the laws of nature and the natural world, and spirituality and spiritualism is absolutely inherent in the cultural relationship that they have to nature. And so I just want to lift that up, considering where we are, and then contrast it with a GDP system that measures a society by how many products it produces and sells, essentially. And it's amazing to me how often GDP is lifted up, even within sustainability circles, as some kind of measure, and even as a way to measure nature. Well, we need to protect nature because GDP depends on nature. So I understand it, and there are a lot of different stakeholders and people that need convincing, and so we can all say that to business leaders to get their attention, right? But we also have to understand that is it really how we want to measure the success of our societies? Because GDP comes out of a measure, and the man Simon Kuznets, who came up with it and won the Nobel Prize in Economics, said, don't ever use this for the measure of a healthy society. Please. But nonetheless, with Bretton Woods in 1948 or so, if I'm getting it wrong, someone say, pretty much codified it. And so what does GDP not measure? It doesn't measure pollution. It doesn't measure depletion of what we call natural resources, what we might also think of as habitat for living species, including ourselves. It doesn't matter inequality of outcomes, so GDP goes way up, but so does the wealth gap. And it doesn't matter positive it doesn't count positive investments in things like preserving a forest for all of the things that it can do for people culturally, as well as, you know, health, mental, physical health, spiritual health. And so I do think that we need to keep in mind in the conversations here that that there's a deeper level on which this shift is happening. And so just to add to that, before I was saying that many of the things that drive biodiversity loss are perfectly legal and socially encouraged. And I think that's where, just to ground us, and I appreciate that other speakers really have in the actual what's going on drafting, in the drafting and negotiating rooms. You know, one way to look at that is the subsidies. And so that's what we're encouraging. That's also destroying. That's a good place to really focus in on shifting this way of thinking, this model. Is all of the things that are being encouraged now need to be stopped. And I would say one other thing, just from the field of ethics. There's an ethicist who went to Union Seminary, where a Center for Earth Ethics is based, named Cynthia Mola-Beta, who wrote a book and writes and speaks about this concept of structural evil. And structural evil. And she draws on the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was executed by the Nazis when he went back to Germany to oppose Hitler. So you get the idea of structural evil. She writes that one of the main characteristics of structural evil is that it easily masquerades as good. So in all of these conversations, we have to watch out for those things that are masquerading as good, but if it's about GDP growth, if it's about jobs, if it's about development and progress and all these things, let's just make sure that it is true to what we know about what is human flourishing and happiness and health, and not just trying to sustain markets and capitalism for those that are making money off of the current system and they don't want it to stop. So thanks for that. Sorry I went on so long.
Thanks, Greta. Lauren, I'm curious, then from you, as you look at, because you're an interfaith minister, you do a lot of this, like a lot of the work that URI is focusing on is on this interfaith. And so we've got, I'm curious for your take on how does this interfaith cooperation help break down some of these barriers, create some of these peacemaking moments, and helping us to think about what actually does matter, and where you see this ecosystem piece really integrating on those through lines.
So I think it's step 2 in the guidebook, where the first sentence says, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, it's okay. And that's why, right? Because we're talking about so many issues that feel like they're competing or they're in separate compartments, but we know that they're kind of connected. But I'm not hearing about this very much when I go to church on Sunday, or when I go to the mosque, or when I'm sitting in my Sangha. So how do I connect these dots? And can I really hold any influence at all? And that, I think, is the overwhelm that we feel. And what I would say in my role at URI, but also as an interfaith chaplain, is we want to have enough courage and curiosity that we wade into the mess. Let's just start to get into the mess a little bit, and let's have some conversations. It's okay if I'm not a subject area expert. That's why I'm going to invite the people who are. So as I come into this messy ecosystem, who needs to be at the table with me? And I'm doing this in the spirit of restoring myself as you restore yourself, and we restore the land and the water on which we live. I don't know if that completely addresses where you were going, but feel free to add some more.
No, thanks. I actually want to ask you, Diane, because we're talking about stakeholders, we're talking about restoration, we're talking about these larger systems, and so I'm curious from your vantage point, and just to contextualize a little bit, when we work with faith communities, there's a conversation that happens I'm just looking around, I see a number of faith, different traditions represented. And so there's work that can be done internally in our own communities, in our own denominations. But then there's also, I think, this sensibility of faith groups wanting to help speak into these processes, to think that, you know, they're not just a moral voice pleading with the world to do well, but thinking about how do we institutionalize some of these ideas? How does this come into play? How do we move beyond this simplicity of the GDP and say, well, there's all these other indicators and indices that we should be measuring. So I'm curious for your thoughts there, how that might work out, and even with DART and the things that you're doing, how we might be able to help contribute to that conversation.
Thank you very much. It's a very valid question, and it does speak to some of my thoughts, because it's really time to uplift the dialogues and conversations into action. And one of the things that I would think would make a change is getting involved in the science. I mean, the science is saying a lot of things. We're losing 1 million species at an alarming state, and if we continue as the status quo, it's going to be worse by 2030. So what can we do in order to change that? I think there needs to be, now that the faith-based organizations and interfaith mechanisms are more involved in the negotiations. Some of them are sitting in the target rooms. There's a target on the subsidies, a target on how to evaluate the values of nature, which in the reports is still under-evaluated. I mean, I'm reading a lot of those reports. It's still talking to GDP, not talking to the underlying values of spirituality and the values of healthy species, healthy genetic resources. So I think that that needs to be elevated. The science behind, the values should be uplifted in the reports, because the reports is what is going to TV and the media in the end, and the media are what everybody is hearing, but not hearing to the voice of what is happening in the science. And so I think the involvement of faith-based organization is crucial, and meaning crucial, sitting in the rooms where the science policies are discussions are taking place, meaning that the science is elevated to the policy level, because policy action drives more change at the local level. I think it would help at least to uplift the actions by those who are sitting in the communities. And imagine in 10 years how many cities, the cities are going to just grow more. I mean, I think, and invading more and encroach more into the natural ecosystems. And target goal 2 and 3 talk about those things. I think those are where we need to listen into how many billions of hectares are going to be protected in 80 years or maybe beyond that by 2050. We need to really elevate and escalate and accelerate action to really achieve those goals, and by involving all the stakeholders and in action. Thank you.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think one thing that we took away from these ecosystem conversations is that longevity piece of this isn't just a one and done sort of thing. This is, you can't just plant a tree and walk away from it. It's how are you nurturing that tree? What is the relationship that you grow with that tree? The difference between tree planting and tree growing, right? And I think that's so much of what this conversation is. Like 2030 is a great goal, but I feel like in so many ways these dates are kind of arbitrary, and they create a false sense of security in terms of action or when things need to be done. Who knows? I think I was reading the other day that with extinction, it's almost this game of Russian roulette where you don't know which one really matters until it's gone. And so there is this, as we look at these numbers, as we look at the complexity of these systems, it's really this holistic approach. And so, Oscar, you and we were sitting, I remember, at COP27 at the end of the day. It was a long day. And and this negotiation piece, because there's this conversation that happens down here in these situations, these places where we try to grow power and tell stories, but then there's these negotiations. I remember you saying to me that there's a sense of spiritual warfare. It's very, there's a violence that happens in these spaces, because on the one hand you have people advocating for life, and on the other hand you have people advocating for tomorrow's paycheck. I'm not sure. And so I'm curious for you, because you are so deeply engaged in these negotiations, and you work so much in these multi-stakeholder groups. You know, where do you see opportunity as well for this kind of immersion of life, of holistic, and then also how do we sustain this sort of fight as we look at what's coming down the road and what we're really trying to fight for?
I think that this is like every other conference. This is a community. Whether in the community we love or hate each other, that's a different matter. But you know, personally, I have a lot of frenemies, like people that I deeply disagree, but still we have a deep sense of connection and a human connection. And I think one of the things that I think COVID somehow, and I see that also in Glasgow and in the G20, is like after the COVID, where we started just to go back, quote, back to normal and all these conferences again, what we have seen is a sense of polarities. Like the polarities actually we are more certain about what we do believe rather than how we are listening to others just to build the bridges. So there is something about that we lost that patience in listening and looking the others and really try just to create a consensus. And I think we have lost that sense that you know, consensus, we will never be happy with consensus, but at least it's ours. It's something that belongs to all of us because we are all building that. And I think that we have lost that, and there is type of a more extreme discourse. We see here the tension between the North and the South countries, with, you know, and of course there is always one story more than the story that we are told. And I think that there is something that we are still struggling in looking into that. And I do believe that one element that for the faith-based organization, Abbas is not a faith-based organization, but I am a person of faith. We, the people of faith, we are, whatever faith we have, we are here to celebrate life and to defend life in all forms. And I think that's basically what has to guide us in whatever negotiation we have. If there is like groups that basically are calling like, well, we need just to make the distinction between indigenous peoples and local communities and it has to be different, and then we need just to watch how that will impact in local communities, that separation. Or if the Holy See is just saying that we don't need just to talk much about gender because that's not helpful, then we need just to watch out because, I mean, there is something that it will impact the dignity of women, and so on and so forth. I think that there is something like we need just to watch how we really bring all of us together in a space in which what is non-negotiable is the protection of life in all forms. And I think that also means that the ones that actually are negotiating life on behalf of all species, all living beings, are the humans. So we do have a responsibility here, but we also have the responsibility to look at ourselves, to not have an anthropocentric perspective on this, and really open up different elements such as, you know, nature rights, and really bring the other voices. And that also sometimes means, and that's something that I do usually, is I go to the field and I try just to listen the animals, I try just to listen at the vegetables and the trees, just to try just to really listen and just see what nature is telling me to do today. And a lot of my friends and my colleagues, especially in these spaces, this sounds a bit crazy, which it might be, but I think how crazy it is, this place, that after a week, we haven't really got every agreement in place with the most educated people, the most prepared people, and yet we are just at 11 hours without much agreement.
Yeah, it's tough. It's really tough. And I do think, I mean, it is funny because there's this sense of, you say that, you know, you go to listen to nature and you go to, you know, be in place and in communion, and you see a bunch of heads just nod and be like, yeah, absolutely, that's right. And I think there is this kind of, there's this forced separation that needs to be deconstructed between ourselves and the natural, between ourselves and that spiritual side. And there's, I think to your to kind of this conversation around GDP and what is success, what is healthy, when we just are so fixated on one thing, how many other things have to be brushed away in order to get there? What part of ourselves need to be lost in order to gain a certain goal? And so there's, I think there's this fullness, this holistic piece of these parts of bringing our full selves into these conversations. I'm always shocked when we host these sort of consultations. I'll invite somebody from a development agency or from the UN or a scientist, and I want them to talk about one thing, but in the end they just want to talk about their own spiritual journey or how they feel about these things because of what we're asked to close off, to be into a certain space. And so with that in mind, I also want to open up to any questions from any of you in the audience. We've got about 10 minutes left or so. If anything you want to raise up or ask in this space. You might have to come up here.
Oh, okay, if you say so. Thank you very much for this privilege to be able to say one of the things in this very important, very critical, very essential presentation. I want to think, and I strongly believe that, you know, we can't be talking about having to live in harmony with nature by 2050 without bringing in the faith component. You know, when I actually got this particular event and saw that it was faith-based, I some sort of beamed in my spirit, because there is nothing we can actually achieve without faith. When we talk of ambition, you know, having a global motivated ambition, in actual fact that word ambition can be replaced with faith, because once you have a perspective of what you want to achieve, somebody defined faith as the substance of things hoped for. In actual fact, if we're expecting that we will achieve whatsoever, if agreement shall be arrived at in this particular meeting on how the post-2020 global governance framework would look like, we would need a component of faith for its achievement. And I think what you're actually doing, she shared with us that we're working with about 103 countries. I think if you actually intensify the faith component, which I have been working on the data reporting tool for data collection, and we have realized that when we work closely with faith-based organizations, we tend to receive genuine data, we tend to receive information that is more valid, and there is a component that is actually missing in other stakeholders who are out of the faith domain. So I want to think that we have to, you know, use this platform, the faith platform, and the guidance that have been, I really want to read through the guidance document as well, to be able to know how to implement this. And when we go back to the field, truly speaking, when we talk of restoration, it takes faith to know that something has been destroyed that has to be restored, or something has been tampered with that needs to be examined. And when you look at it through the eyes of faith, you see it more. It becomes clearer to you. It becomes something impactful, and you go for the implementation of that aspect, not because of what people say, not because of what circumstances around may dictate, but because you are faith-based, because you're looking at it from a faith component, that it is possible for it to be achieved. And that said, I think if all of us follow this approach, this faith, whether you're Muslim, whether you are Buddhist, whether you're a Christian, whether you go to church or you don't go, there is a component that is fitted into this particular framework, which is called faith. And that's what I want to say, and to encourage each and every one of us. As I'm going back, in fact, UNEP has given us a wonderful tool for the collection of data, which we must, the data reporting tool platform, brackets have been removed from it, but it doesn't end there. We need faith, and we need to include those who are faith-based, those who can give us transparent, genuine, and accurate data, and who can jointly work with us to achieve harmony with nature, which is so important at a point like this, to receive harmony with nature by 2050. Thank you very much. We don't have much time. I would have talked tomorrow on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, please, Blaine.
Hello, thank you very much for your conversation, very to the point, enlightening. I was thinking, sitting there, that what we really need is a change of awareness to have things move forward. We are aware that in the climate change conversation, as well as here, we're kind of stuck, to be truthful. We're kind of stuck not only at the level of negotiations, but also in lifestyle. So how do you guys think we could do something to change awareness?
I would just, my succinct answer would be to absolutely think about the Haudenosaunee Address and our sacred texts and how they invite us into sacred reciprocity with ourselves, with one another, and with all kin, with all of creation.
The first thing I think about is our report sitting right now at the CBD COP15 Information Document 20. It's the UNEP document that captured the partnership that happened with the interfaith organizations and mechanisms and wonderful work. But it's sitting in a paragraph in that document, and I'm wondering how many people are going to read it, although it's reported. Is it going to raise awareness, or does it need more on maybe those case studies that have been in that report in many of the countries, and the rivers, and there was a lot that was captured in that report. I'm just wondering how to elevate that, do something more about it to really escalate it. But I'm sure there are wonderful things that we can do with social media and Twitter and you know, the things that people are reading, and the youth and the intergenerational equity that the 2050 vision is only for a few of us, and then there's going to be a new generation. I think there needs to be more action with the youth. Thank you.
I think that awareness has to be, we need just to reframe what awareness means. I think that there is a sense of awakening among ourselves, and in particularly that awakening is that call of a radical generosity in urgency, radical generosity in agency, and radical generosity in action. Because I think the awareness, we are aware what's going on in the world, and we get depressed. And I think that we do have a responsibility, especially to our kids that are right now in a space of anxiety. And Abbas has, we funded several studies indicating how kids are actually losing hope in the world. And the level of anxiety, psychological anxiety across the G20 countries, for instance, is very high, 71% in the US, 83% in Argentina, 79% in Brazil, and I can just keep going those numbers. So our generation is losing faith in ourselves, and they have the anxiety because they know that the world, they're more anxious not about the ecological crisis, but the lack of action of the politicians. So what we need just to really the other day I was in very close to here, and then there was a kid of 10 years old here, sitting down and asking questions, and it really breaks my heart, because why on earth a kid of 10 years old has to be forced just to be at such an early stage of having activism, just because the adults in this room are not acting like one. So I think that there is something about bringing the spirituality of that principle that everything that you don't give, you lose. And I think that this space, we are calling for that generosity to all the parties, and not speaking here as negotiators, but as human beings, as parents, as uncles, as sisters, and really bring that humanity back. I think that is where we make us aware that we are here a community that we do have a very privileged responsibility to really guide all of us into a different path.
You should say something.
I just lost my train of thought, but I've so enjoyed this, and I guess one of the things that I'd like to add to that about how to think about this awareness is the humility, and I think that a lot of times faith communities, faith, sacred texts and teachings, faith itself does have that sense that there is something greater than ourselves that we cannot fully apprehend and know, that human beings are not God. A lot of times, in spaces that maybe would say they're secular spaces, there's a kind of inherent sort of assumption that human beings are really all-knowing, and that we are at the pinnacle and height of our powers in understanding how everything works, and we're going to fix it now perfectly. And sometimes it's just really important to sit back and think a little bit about all the things we don't know, and that does include not just the dark matter in the universe, vast majority of the universe apparently, according to scientists, who tell us what they know, which is what they don't know sometimes, but also the microbes in the soil, all of the ways in which this web of life interacts to hold and sustain life. So I think that as we come to awareness and as we think about the role that spirituality plays, we shouldn't underestimate how much we need humility to counter the hubris that has gotten us to this point. And I just really recommend watching these consultations. I'm so grateful to my colleague Andrew who took the lead on them, and to Lauren for coming in and making sure that we can reach people through these circles of cooperation. What a wonderful concept. But I think if you watch these, you'll see that people really come with the stories and with the knowledge, including the reverence for other species of life, like the Philippine eagle, for example, is the focus of one of these. Other species intelligence, what do they know? That if we just sat back and created the spaces for them to live, we might really benefit in ways that we can only imagine. So thank you for this great work, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Corinne. And thank you to all the panelists. On the back, here's a QR code that will take you to the Center for Earth Ethics site, where you can download the guide. It'll be a big gray box on the screen. We're fixing that. If you just click download, you can see the guide. We'd be delighted if you would use it and share it. We will be coming out with another guide early next year that will speak much more to the principles, to more of the philosophical and theological aspects of this work, of thinking about different ways of engaging with ecosystem restoration in a variety of social, cultural ways and theological, faith-based ways. And so that will be coming early next year as a compendium to this. And again, an enormous piece of gratitude to everyone who took part of the consultation series. Unfortunately, all of them can't be up here. I'm just a messenger for the I don't know, 40 some people who contributed in big ways. Enormous thanks to URI, to UNEP's Faith for Earth, to EI. Gopal Patel, who's not here, was a major part of this. And just thank you to you for showing up in this space, in this time, in this way. I do think that there are opportunities to slow down and take a deep breath so that we can speed up and do the work that we need to do, especially in times where things feel so chaotic. And so I just, again, thank you, many blessings and appreciations, and I look forward to opportunities to work together on this going forward. Thanks.